who've decided to join us on, I called it a Towards a Green Recovery virtual town hall with our special guest, the Honourable Jonathan Wilkinson, who's the Minister of Environment and Climate Change. I do want to also start off with a land recognition. I'm acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory here in the center of Toronto of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. And it's now home to a diverse number of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, which we're really honored to have among us. As I mentioned, the agenda is going to be as follows. We're going to hear from the minister, who's going to talk to us about the really huge announcement that we made last Friday. So he'll start off with 3 to 5 minutes on that, and then I'm going to jump into the questions. And Minister, before you came, I had indicated we had about 180 people sign up to join, and probably have about 150 questions. So I hope you're ready to be with us for 5 hours, since we have many questions for you. Luckily, I can group them, so I think I can sort of fit most of them in within the next hour. And I will tell you, I'll start off with a question, then I'll go to a Davenport resident, and then come back to me. And so it'll be sort of a little bit of a back and forth, because what I'm trying to do in my questions is consolidate a lot of the questions that have come in, since your staff would not allow me to keep you for 5 hours. So anyways, and I just want to let everybody know that Minister Wilkinson, I booked him about a month ago, because I said to him, Minister Wilkinson, the #1 question in Davenport is a green recovery and environment, and how are we, as we are restarting our economy, how are we going to make sure that climate change and our commitment to net zero and achieving our Paris Accord targets are going to be top of mind. I said, this is really important for Davenport. I had asked him to join us, and I feel really lucky that we managed to book him, and it happened to be right after his big announcement. So I think with that, Minister, I'm going to give a tiny bit of an introduction on you, just because you're super impressive, and not many people sort of know your background. I think most people know that you are the Member of Parliament for North Vancouver. You were elected first in 2015, with the incoming class of 2015, which is what I was a part of as well. You were raised in Saskatchewan. You're former CEO of a couple of companies called Questar Technologies, and also Biotech Environmental Technologies, which is now known as BQE Water. You're a Rhodes Scholar, which I did not know, so congratulations. And you have quite a bit of background in working in Saskatchewan with the former Premier of Saskatchewan, Roy Romanov, and you were a constitutional negotiator and had done quite a bit of work on federal-provincial relations. So we're very honored that you are our Minister of Climate Change. I call it Environment Climate Change, and I think it's sustainability as well. So I think with that, a warm welcome to you, and I'll turn over to you to say a few words to get us started.
Sure, thank you, Julie, and thanks for the invitation to come. You're right. I grew up in Saskatchewan, and I now live in British Columbia. But I actually do have some roots in Ontario. I was actually born in the Sioux, and I spent several years actually working in Toronto before I moved to British Columbia. So I know a little bit about Toronto. I would also like to start by acknowledging the territory on which I am coming to you from, which is in North Vancouver, is located on the traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Let me just start by saying you have a great MP. We are all very lucky to have her in our caucus, and you are, I think, very lucky to have her as your Member of Parliament. She is very active on a whole range of files, but certainly probably the most active on environment and climate change related files, and talks to me all the time about the issues and the concerns that people in the riding have. Let me talk mainly about climate change, but I'd be happy to talk about other environmental issues that are on the horizon. Certainly biodiversity decline is a huge one. Plastics issues are very important, and of course the reform of the Canadian Environmental Protection Act is also a very significant undertaking. Certainly, it has been a very difficult year for all of us. And as we come to a close, I think we all are reflecting on some of the challenges, both personally and professionally, that we've all had. But I also feel a bit more optimistic as we come to the end of the year than perhaps I was 6 or 7 months ago. And part of that obviously is a ray of hope associated with vaccines starting to arrive in this country. Um, but I think part of it is also that we are, as a society, starting to look forward to some of the things that are challenges on the horizon, but also offer significant opportunities. And as Julie said, I was very pleased on Friday to join the Prime Minister to announce Canada's Strengthened Climate Plan. It was a plan that is focused on helping to achieve the economic hopes and the environmental goals of Canadians. It is a plan that I believe will help us build back from the pandemic, and that will ensure that the world that we will pass on to our children in the longer term will be cleaner and more prosperous. For the first time in Canadian history, Canada now has a very detailed, articulated plan that demonstrates how we will meet and exceed our current targets. We also have introduced into Parliament a bill that will require far more transparency and accountability on the part of governments with respect to climate change and the pathway with the pathways that we will need to define to achieve a net zero society by 2050. Certainly, the climate plan has a whole range of elements in it. Some of them are regulatory. There was about $15 billion in new program spending associated with making our homes and buildings, community centers, libraries, hockey rinks more energy efficient, providing better access to clean transportation options, whether that's public transit or active transportation, or incentives to purchase zero emission vehicles. It definitely builds on the work that the government started with the Pan-Canadian Framework, which you will all recall, that got us a significant way towards our Paris Agreement targets. But of course, there was always a gap to be closed to achieve the target. And that's what this plan essentially does. The other element of the plan beyond regulations and investments, people will know because it's what the media has tended to focus on, is the price on pollution. We are very much of the view that pollution should not be free in any part of the country, that we need to ensure that we're creating a price signal so that people choose energy efficiency, low carbon products and services, and that we return the money back such that that policy is both effective in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and incenting innovation, but it's also affordable. You will find that by and large, the folks of more modest incomes actually get significantly more money back than people, or as a proportion of income, than people who are better off, and that the average Canadian family gets more money back than they actually pay. Some of you will probably have seen the comments of Premier Ford. I'm a pretty practical person, and it does cause me significant concern when elected figures say things that are patently false. I think there is lots of room in politics for debate about ideas and for disagreeing with respect to our ideological orientations, but facts are facts. And some of the things that Premier Ford has said are either deliberately misleading, or he simply doesn't understand how the price on pollution works. And I have indicated a couple of times in media interviews that I'd be very happy to sit down with him to explain to him how it actually works. As you know, the price on pollution works, as I said, by incenting behavior, but we do return the money back so that it is an affordable policy for people. My concern about climate change and the kind of Canada that my kids would be inheriting is the main reason I got into politics. As Julie said, I was in the clean technology space for well over 15 years. My youngest daughter, who is actually in Toronto going to university in first year university, is a constant source of inspiration. She often would sit at the table with me before she went to Toronto and say, "Dad, you're not doing enough to fight climate change." While climate change is certainly a huge challenge, it is also an enormous opportunity. Increasingly, taking action on climate also makes good economic sense. In public opinion polls these days, Canadians actually understand that. They know that fighting change is actually good for the economy, not bad for it. Our major competitors around the world, including Europe, China, and now increasingly the United States, are moving towards a clean economy to ensure that they are taking advantage of the opportunities that a low carbon world will provide. And that means that we need to be doing the same thing. We need to significantly decarbonize, move towards a clean economy, create an economy that will thrive in the future. I think you will all have seen Prime Minister Trudeau's announcement at the Ford Oakville plant to retool, to begin making electric vehicles. That's the kind of investment for the future that can put Canada amongst the leaders in the global economy as it moves towards lower carbon. And so I would just close by saying the plan that I announced Friday, the intention is to create both a healthier environment and a healthier economy, to ensure that we will pass on to our children and to future generations a world that is both cleaner and prosperous. And with that, I very much look forward to engaging with you and having a conversation this evening.
Thank you so much, Minister. That was very helpful. Although people should be aware that if you actually read the announcement that the minister made on Friday, it's actually many pages and lots of details. And I'm glad, I know you didn't have a chance to go through it all today, but hopefully some of our questions will touch on it. Minister, I'm just going to start off first, just because you alluded to it, but I think it's very important for us to state this very clearly. Premier Ford did indicate that because of the climate plan we announced on Friday, that Ontarians will be paying 30% more on everything. So gas, food, cosmetic services, and restaurants, and it's a 30% tax grad. Can you just clarify, is that going to be the case?
No, I mean, Premier Ford is simply wrong. And as I said, he's either deliberately saying things that are not true, or he just doesn't understand how the price on pollution works. And, you know, I would direct him to the Globe and Mail editorial, to the Toronto Star editorial, to a number of economists who, like Mark Jacquard and others, who have written since the announcement, if he needs further explanation. I mean, the price on pollution is put there to incent people to make, and businesses to make choices about lowering their carbon footprint. But we recycle all of that money back. I mean, I don't call it a carbon tax because it's not a tax. A tax typically is raising revenue for the purposes of government spending. What we do with a price on pollution is we raise revenues through that to change behavior, and we return the money back. 90% of the money goes back to Canadian households. The average family actually pays less, significantly less, than what they get back. So, you know, it is actually a tool of redistributing income in some respects from people and businesses that are heavy emitters to those that are less. And so Premier Ford is simply incorrect. And you know, I would be more than happy to have that conversation with him live.
Thank you. So I'm going to sort of go to two of our constituents. So get ready, Derek Ritz and Shannon Hoff. But Minister, in your Friday announcement, you announced our Strength at Climate Plan. You indicated how we are not only committed to meeting, but exceeding our 2030 emissions targets set on the Paris Agreement. And so now Derek Ritz has a specific question related to that. And then I'll also have Shannon Hoff then speak. And once they give their two questions, I'll come back to you. Over to you, Derek.
Thanks, Julie, and thanks again for having these town halls. They're very helpful. Thank you, Minister, for joining us for this one. In the new plan, there's carrots and there's sticks and there's parts that the Government of Canada exerts governance over on its own. But where are the parts where we need the provinces to be on side? In simple terms, what's the role of the provinces in making this a success? And if there are risks there, and I think that there may well be, how can we mitigate those?
Perfect. Thank you, Derek.
Yeah.
And hold on a
Sorry.
second, Minister. I'm going to get one more in and then
Okay.
have you sort of, Shannon, can you ask your question now as well?
Yes. Hello. Thank you for being here, Minister Wilkinson. The climate crisis is much more urgent and much more demanding, I think, than Bill C-12 implies. And we all depend on your action in the present, in this government's timeline. My question is, will you press for adoption of legally binding targets for 2025 and 2030 within that governing timeline?
Thank you so much, Shannon. Over back to you, Minister.
Okay, both very good questions. So you are right. The role of provinces is a very important one. Canada is a very complicated country from a jurisdictional perspective, and as you know, there are some areas that are fully provincial, and there are some areas that are quite federal. With the new climate plan, what we tried to do was, by and large, focus on those instruments that are federal to be able to drive change with respect to emissions and with respect to economic competitiveness, with the intent that we will engage the provinces going forward with respect to how they can use some of the tools that are within their jurisdictional authority to help us to accelerate change. So we haven't assumed any additional provincial action in the modeling work that we've done underpinning the plan. But you're right, there are some areas where provincial action is, well, let me break it into two pieces, where it's required and where it would be very desirable. There are a couple of areas that probably the most significant one is in the area of building codes, where typically what happens is the federal government will develop a model building code, and then provinces adopt it because that is within their jurisdiction. One of the things that we need to do with buildings, there was a number of things around retrofitting existing buildings in the plan that was announced, but one of the things that we need to do over the next few years is ensure that we have a national building code by no later than 2030, and ideally significantly before, which is a net zero building code, where all of the buildings that we are putting up that will still exist in 2050 are essentially net zero. And we need the provinces to adopt those building codes in that context. I actually think that's not going to be a huge challenge because I don't think that's a particularly controversial part of addressing climate change from a federal provincial perspective, but certainly there are areas where we are going to need provincial action. I think that there is also areas where additional provincial action would be hugely desirable. So I take, for example, one of the things that we are continuing to offer is an incentive for people to purchase zero emission vehicles, because at a time right now there is still a gap between internal combustion engines and electric vehicles. That will change as electric vehicles come down that experience curve. They will become more affordable, and there will be many more options in terms of supply. But in British Columbia, they have a vehicle incentive alongside the federal vehicle incentive. And British Columbia right now is selling 1 out of 10 cars that are being sold are zero emission vehicles. That's far higher than anywhere else in the rest of the country. And so I do think that there are areas where additional provincial action are highly desirable, and that is something that we certainly intend to be engaging the provinces on as we go forward. And the second issue, Bill C-12. Yes, it is urgent, and yes, that's the whole point of Bill C-12 is actually to make these targets legally binding. Such that governments actually have to not only set a target, but they have to have a plan. As you will know, under Prime Minister Harper, they set a target and they never had a plan. That doesn't really help you very much. And then you have to report on progress publicly in Parliament about the progress you're making relative to the plan. And then at the milestone date, you have to report on whether you've made the target, and if not, what you're going to do to get back into accord with the targets going forward. There's also, as you know, a third-party entity through the Environment Commissioner to essentially track and report on progress from a third party. And so the 2030 target for sure is legally binding. What I would say is a lot of people are getting, talking about a 2025 target. And I think what underpins that is people want to ensure that there's accountability on the part of governments in the short term, including this government. And I think that's completely fair. But I would say that there are different ways to go about that. I'm not a big fan of a 2025 target because effectively the Paris Agreement was structured around 2030. Every country in the world, with the exception of a handful, have 2030 targets, and they've focused all of their efforts on driving towards emissions reductions that will actually take place over the course of the coming decade to 2030. If we were to go to embed a 2025 target, we would actually need to spend quite a bit of time and effort to develop a plan that's focused on 2025. Which actually may be not particularly prudent in the context of actually getting the kinds of emissions reductions we want in 2030. It will force you into much shorter term thinking. And it will take an enormous amount of time on the part of the officials who work in my department rather than focusing on actually driving emissions. But I do take the point that people expect that there's going to be accountability on this government too. And so I'm very open, and I've said this to the opposition parties, to the idea that there must be earlier progress reports. The Environment Commissioner is talking about doing one as early as 2022. Certainly there can be reports to Parliament earlier than what are in the current bill. And so there's a conversation going on in Parliament about how do you ensure accountability earlier, and I'm certainly open to that.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Minister. And I want to reiterate maybe 2 key points, because I know I hear them quite a bit. And then I'm just going to sort of warn Tanya Gill, you're up next on your advisory board question. So, Minister, I think that it is something that I know Davenport residents ask me all the time, what progress have we made? And you're right, they want to see the progress. So it's not just I think the impression is, no one wants to see the impression is that, well, we're leaving it to future governments. It's, we are going to show progress. So I think if you're able to articulate maybe in sort of when you're responding to the next set of questions, maybe what progress can we legitimately show that we've made so far? And the other thing that I think a lot of people worry about is if, I'm hoping that we as a government stay in for a while, but if there's a change in government, I think there's always a fear that we're not, there's not legislative changes that really will lock people in to sort of continue to commit to our 2050 goals. So I'll leave you with that, and I'll have Tanya Gill, Minister, just in advance of introducing her. She's a really wonderful environmental champion in our community. She very much is part of the Fridays for Future sort of rallies that happen in our downtown core in Toronto. And her question is actually coming on behalf of 11 other Davenport residents that she's spoken to, and who know that many of them are on today, but she's asking her question on behalf of them. So over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. Yes, I support the Fridays for the 11 Davenport residents I'm speaking on behalf of support the Fridays for Future global campaign called the Fight for 1.5. And we know there is a chance of holding warming to 1.5 degrees, but only if the world accomplishes a 45% carbon reduction by 2030. And I know Bill C-12 is extremely important to get us there, although that's a more ambitious target than is currently in place. But my question is about the advisory body. Bill C-12 must place greater emphasis on science and expertise and less emphasis on politics by strengthening the advisory body's role in establishing targets, plans, and reports, and ensuring the body is comprised of independent experts. So my question is, will the minister pledge that the independent advisory body be composed of scientists, experts, and Indigenous people and play a role in establishing targets?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tanya. So over to you, Minister. And maybe you could explain just to everyone, just remind everyone the role of the advisory body in relation to our climate targets.
Sure. So we will certainly be bringing forward a terms of reference with respect to the advisory body, and the focus of the advisory body is to provide advice to the minister with respect to defining pathways to 2050, pathways to net zero by 2050. Certainly the reports of the panel will be public, so it will be transparent in terms of the advice that's being provided. The intention behind the advisory body is that it will be regionally reflective, it will be sectorally reflective, it will include Indigenous peoples and environmental organizations, youth representatives, as well as industry representatives, and that it will essentially be a body that is doing a lot of thinking about the ways in which to solve what are not insignificant challenges. Certainly, there will be conversations about targets as we go forward with respect to the advisory body, but ultimately, the responsibility for establishing the target and inserting them in the legislation belongs to the government. But I would say the advisory body will be stood up actually quite soon, and it will play an integral role, and it will be, I think, something that attempts to reflect the diverse perspectives that there exist in this country on these issues. And part of the point of the advisory body is to force those kinds of hard conversations within the room, such that they can provide appropriate advice to this government and future governments.
So, Minister, just because I'm going to bring it back, because I know Tanya's going to call me after this and say, but are we going to have the best in class scientists? I think that's what we're looking for.
And there will be scientific representation on the council.
And experts, and then Indigenous people. Will we have representation from each, like from scientists as well as Indigenous people? Will we have those on the committee?
There will be both Indigenous and scientific representation.
Okay, perfect. That sounds great. And then Tanya, also you should know, I think there's also groups of people that are also, there's lots of voices around trying to make sure that the recommendations of the advisory body is also transparent, so that is seen very public. So it's not just that the advisory body actually makes recommendations, but we don't know what they are, and we can't translate it into seeing what is it that the government actually follows through on. Minister, before I go on to the next question, which will be on fossil fuel subsidies, and Alex Spears-Roche is going to ask about it, do you have any response in terms of if we had to, and I don't want you to go into the whole thing, but if we were to say we have made progress in terms of reducing climate change emissions, we have made tremendous progress in terms of our climate change objectives since we entered government in 2015, how would you respond to that?
Well, I would say a few things. I mean, if you go back to the Pan-Canadian framework, there were like 50 different initiatives. I'm not going to go through all of them and say, but if you had to pick out the ones that are going to make the biggest difference, and some of which you can see the impact of today, and some of you will see the impact in the coming few years. They are things that are kind of foundational. So I would say the biggest one is the accelerated phase out of coal-fired power by 2030. We can now kind of list to you every coal plant in Canada and when it will effectively be shut down. And some have been accelerated significantly. I mean, TransAlta, for example, which used to run a whole bunch of coal plants, is in the process of actually accelerating the phase out that they had even had on the books. That is really important because it helps us to green the electricity network. And if you are going to try to push electrification of transportation, for example, and of some buildings, for example, you got to start with a clean grid. If you don't have a clean grid, running a zero emission vehicle, if you're burning coal to create the electricity, it doesn't help you at all. So that would be a foundational piece. And of course, one of the things in the current climate plan is trying to make sure that we follow that through to 2050 such that we have a net zero grid. And that means trying to ensure that in replacing coal, people are not replacing it, for example, with natural gas. Over the long term, you don't want to end up with stranded assets all over the place because you won't be able to do that in 2050 if you're going to have a net zero grid. So that would be one. I think starting the deployment of the infrastructure network for zero emission vehicles, so starting to broadly deploy infrastructure is critical. You can't get people to buy an electric or a hydrogen car unless they actually have confidence that they can fill it up irrespective of where they go. Other than for folks who live in very urban centers where some vehicle infrastructure existed, that was not a reasonable opportunity or reasonable thing to be asking people to do. And so building out that vehicle infrastructure has been and will continue to be a critical piece. Parts of this country, like where I'm from in British Columbia, you can go to any small town and there's infrastructure to charge an electric car. But that's because both the federal government and the province have been very active in building that out. We need to be doing that far more across the rest of the country that will enable us to go from 3% of the cars being sold today in Canada being zero emission to, eventually we need to get to 100% by 2040.
Okay, thanks so much, Minister. The next question is on fossil fuel subsidies. So top big question in my riding. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Alex. Alex, do you want to ask the Minister this question?
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. And likewise, thanks for hosting this event. So Minister Wilkinson, your government has been in power for 5 years and declared a climate emergency, but the federal government is still subsidizing fossil fuels. So my question is, when will you stop subsidizing fossil fuels, including through Export Development Canada and pipelines, and direct that money towards climate action and green recovery?
Thanks so much, Alex. And Minister, I'm going to turn it directly to you. I will tell you this is probably one of the top questions within the Davenport riding, so would be grateful for you to address this. Thanks.
So look, it's a good and it's a fair question. And what I would say is a couple things. The first is Canada has made a commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies in concert with the G20, and that's to be done by 2025. In that context, and all G20 countries have committed to that. In that context, Canada has already phased out 8 different tax-related measures that were used that were deemed to be fossil fuel subsidies, but there is a ways to go for sure, and we need to continue to work on that. I would say that there are a couple of elements. So you mentioned EDC, and I think that's a reasonable question. I think everybody is starting to think about the whole issue of export finance. I don't know if you're aware, but the United Kingdom just a few days ago announced that it would stop doing export finance for fossil fuels. part of the climate plan that we announced on Friday was actually a commitment to introduce what we call the climate lens on all decision making within the government, including the Crown corporations, which means that you actually have to look at the climate implications of all of the policies that you are looking at putting into place. That will be a conversation that will certainly involve EDC, and I don't want to get ahead of myself because I obviously have to work with my colleagues on this, but I do think that that's a relevant question to be raised in that context. The last thing I would say on the fossil fuel subsidies is it's also important that we at least try to get to a common definition of what we mean by that. So when I talk about fossil fuel subsidies, I'm typically talking about tools that incent the exploration and the production of fossil fuels. And those are the things that we have committed already to phase out. I am not talking about investments that we may make with companies in the energy sector to reduce their emissions significantly, to try to actually make significant reductions in their emissions on the pathway to a net zero future. And through this transition. So for example, the government may partner with an oil and gas company to actually do work on hydrogen and through doing that to significantly reduce the way in which the amount of emissions that their refineries produce, or to electrify the upstream. I don't view those as subsidies. I view those as fossil fuel subsidies. I view those as part of an active climate plan that's actually driving towards achieving your targets in net zero. We all recognize that there will have to be by 2050 a completely different way in which we actually produce and use energy, and it will have to be non-emitting. But in the pathway there, we need to be taking steps to get there. And so I think that's a legitimate area where we can have a conversation and debate. But I don't think there's any debate about the broader sort of exploration and production. I think most countries have agreed that those need to be phased out. The last thing I would say is, in Canada, it's also important to look at different levels of government. So often when people use a big number in terms of what fossil fuel subsidies exist, they're lumping everything together. At the federal level, there aren't that many. There's still some, and they need to be eliminated. But we also need to be working with our provincial and territorial governments to have them moving in this direction, because the bulk of fossil fuel subsidies in this country are actually in place by provincial governments in Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Okay, so Minister, is it fair for me to say that we've made some progress, but we still have quite a bit of work to do in this area?
We do. We have made progress. We have a commitment internationally with our partners. We're actually doing a peer review with Argentina on fossil fuel subsidies. We review them, they review us. So there is work going on in terms of continuing to move towards what we've agreed to do by 2025.
Well, thank you for that. I do know that there is, I know this came up at Finance Committee last week, and I had asked for a list of which fossil fuel subsidies we should be eliminating immediately that don't relate to direct funding for any types of innovations that you refer to in terms of to our oil and gas sector, or anything to do right now in terms of, we know in the north, much of the north is still fueled by diesel, and there's some supports there. Yep. So I said, outside of that, what is the list? And I believe it's environmental defense that's actually going to come up with the list. So I know I'll be approaching you about that, because I know that this is an ongoing.
You can't get it from finance. You should go talk to my staff. I mean, they'd probably be a little more forthcoming.
So my next question, because I see actually a sign from someone who wants to ask a question on it, is about TMX. So we're going to get there in a minute. But my next question, Minister, that is another big question in Davenport, is actually around the pipeline. So I'm going to go to David Hardy in a moment, who's going to sort of ask the second part of my question. But I think people like Val Endicott in Davenport will say, how can you honestly pursue ambitious climate targets like net zero by 2050 and continue to build the TMX pipeline? So I think that's a legitimate question. And so I would say I'm paraphrasing many questions of those from Davenport. And if I can just ask David to ask David Hardy can ask the second part of that question. David. Is David on, Nasser? Okay, so Nasser, is David on?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. There you go.
Oh, sorry. I
okay.
won't even. This is probably
And
my
I forgot to say, Minister, David Hardy is you know, is a leader within our film sector here. So he works for a large film production company, and so he's part of this really wonderful group of artists, creators, and those who work in the creative industry in my riding. And the reason I mention is I know that in North Vancouver there's a film industry as well. So I thought there was
Big
a bit
one,
of a
yeah,
tie.
big one.
So
just
I
a
just,
little one, yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
I want to say, David, welcome, and please ask your question.
Thanks very much, and sorry about that. I had a great intro there. Julie, thanks again for this opportunity and for hosting these sessions. They're wonderful, and give us a really great interchange or intercourse with our elected officials. And Minister, thanks for taking the time. And as somebody who works in the film industry, and I joked about BC, we have our biggest operations in Burnaby, so
Oh yeah, sure.
I know the Vancouver industry very well. And I just want to congratulate you on the more than probably 100 video conferences I've been on in the last 6 months. You have the best lighting I've ever seen for any video conferencing. So congratulate your staff.
Well, thank you.
They could be working on just go out the door and go down to a film set and hang out.
Okay, David, your question.
Yes, sorry, Julie.
It's okay.
Yes, I just, given the parliamentary budget officers, I think condemnation would be an appropriate phrase of the government's, the apparent contradiction between achieving Paris targets and continuing to fund a pipeline that, unless you say something tomorrow in your announcement with Minister O'Regan, is still pumping fossil fuel and not hydrogen. But how do you equate those two? How do you reconcile that?
And Minister, actually, before you respond, I'll just give the exact quote. It says the federal government could end up losing money on the Trans Mountain Pipeline if it further tightens its climate policy and ends up decreasing demand for Canadian oil, the parliamentary budget officer says. So, you know, first part is, how is it that we can continue to build a TMX pipeline if we're honest about trying to ambitiously pursue our climate targets? And the second part is, the PBO is already starting to say, hello, if you're going to be ambitiously, you know, trying to reduce your emissions, you would have to reduce your oil, and in which case TMX becomes unprofitable. So how do you respond to both of those?
Sure. Well, let me offer you my perspective. I certainly recognize that this is an issue on which there are different views. My riding is North Vancouver, and so the pipeline basically comes into the harbor just adjacent to mine in Terry Beach's riding. And every ship that goes in to be filled up at the current facility, and once the new pipeline is completed, will transit past the water, which is just in front of me. So I can tell you that this has been the subject of lots of conversation in my riding over the course of the last few years, and certainly in the 2019 campaign. And I recognize and respect that people have different perspectives on this. And what I can offer you is my perspective on it, and you can accept it or you can disagree with it. So as we move through the transition to net zero by 2050, it is simply a fact that we are continuing to use hydrocarbons over the next couple of decades. Now, ideally, well, not ideally, that will need to shrink over the course of the time that we progress down the path. But if you think about it, right now in Canada, 3% of transportation is electric or zero emission. 97% continues to be fueled by gasoline. In terms of building heat, it's basically the same story. We need to start to make more progress and more rapidly, certainly as we move forward. And countries around the world will need to make progress in lockstep, particularly developed countries. Developing countries probably have a little bit more time. And in that context, while the world continues to use and consume gasoline and natural gas, it is, I think, reasonable for areas of Canada that produce oil and gas to want to ensure that they continue to extract value from their resources. Certainly from our perspective, the extraction of that value through the Trans Mountain Pipeline, the taxes associated with that will go back into funding the transition and funding green projects that accelerate the transition. But you know, it's hard to understand why we would say that we would not continue to accrue value and help provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan, for example, to actually manage the transition that they will have to make in terms of their economies, during a period where that continues to be the case. Clearly, though, we have to recognize that that will not continue forever. And I know you were joking, but certainly, people are talking about it at some point when you actually are not putting oil through pipelines, that you may end up putting hydrogen. And I know there are some technical issues with that, but it's not unresolvable. I would say with respect to the PBO, with due respect to the PBO, because they're very smart people and they do thoughtful work, I think they kind of missed the point here. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is actually for export. It's not for domestic use. And so certainly the work that we are doing to reduce emissions domestically is almost completely separate from the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Now, that's not to say that we don't need to see reductions in other countries around the world, and Canada doesn't need to be part of pushing other countries to reduce their emissions, which eventually will cut the demand for oil and eventually for gas. But this is a transitional project that assures that we can continue to extract value and that we can do so in a way that doesn't cost Alberta and Saskatchewan the discount that they currently get, because the only customer they have is the United States.
Thank you, Minister. And I do think that this is one of the hardest questions for us. And I think the other thing I say to Davenport residents is we always make the best decisions based on the information we have in front of us. And if things change within 5 years, we make different decisions. So I think you just have to keep on moving based on the business.
I think that's fair. Can I say one more thing? I mean,
Sure.
I think it's also important to say that I'm a Canadian first and foremost. I think I said I was born in Ontario. I grew up in Saskatchewan. I did university in Quebec, and I now live in British Columbia. And I don't believe that it's a responsible position for any federal government to take, that we are going to essentially say we're going to leave one region of the country behind. Mm-hmm. We need to have a plan for the transition that actually brings all regions of the country along with us. That includes Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And yes, there will need to be a transition. Yes, they can't put, those governments can't put their heads in the sand and pretend that it's not happening. But we also need to be open to working with them on pathways that will allow them to transition in a way where their kids are going to have opportunities going forward.
No, and I that was important to say, so I appreciate you saying that. Okay, I'm actually going to switch a little bit. I have Giselle DeGrandis, who's going to come on board, and she's going to go back to something that you had talked a little bit about in terms of transportation and electric vehicles. So, Giselle, over to you.
Hi there, I'm unmuted, hopefully. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Minister, for taking the time. I have two quick questions about transportation, a sector that produces a lot of our emissions. So you mentioned incentives. How do we enable EV adoption in Davenport when we have so few public chargers and lots of residents who don't have garages? We also have no EV car share programs here. And then my second question is, will this government send a clear signal to car makers and consumers by banning sales of new gas and diesel vehicles by 2030?
Okay. Thanks so much, Giselle, and thanks for your leadership on environmental issues. Over to you, Minister.
Again, really good question. Yes, in areas where there are garages, it's much simpler, isn't it? And in areas where there are not garages, we actually need to continue to build out the infrastructure so there are public areas or places at existing gasoline stations where people can actually go and charge. I mean, clearly gasoline stations are going to have to think about how they can be part of this transition too, as their core business will start to decline at some point. We're already seeing in British Columbia, it's a little bit different, but in British Columbia, hydrogen is actually a bigger thing out here. It has been for a long time. There are a number of gas stations that have now installed hydrogen pumps. And so I do think that we need to continue to invest in the build out of the infrastructure, because that's a critical enabler for people to feel like they can purchase an electric vehicle. And I also hear your point. I'm surprised that you don't have any EV car share. That's interesting. We do.
No, we have 10 around our my office. 10 electric vehicle charging stations are that around. I just learned this recently. So Giselle, if you didn't know it, I just recently learned it. So don't feel badly. And every time an environmental organization or environmental group within Davenport calls me, I say, please apply for these EV charging stations. We need more EV sort of infrastructure in our own riding. But anyways, please go ahead, Minister.
But so I do think the infrastructure is an important piece. I do think that that helping to close the gap in terms of the costs between EVs and internal combustion engines is important. I do think having a greater breadth of models so that there are cars that are more affordable, that are electric for people who are not going to buy a Tesla, for example, is going to be really important. And so all of that's part of our plan. Then there are sort of the sticks, right? And so there are discussions around a ZEV supply mandate, which exists in Quebec and in British Columbia, which was mentioned in our climate plan, and also the potential for a ban, as you talked about, which the United Kingdom has done, France has done. And both of those issues are on the table. Our decision in the context of this climate plan was, rather than make that decision right now, we have many issues that are continental. There's no more than the auto sector that we believe can probably be most effectively addressed with President-elect Biden's administration. So they've made a number of commitments with respect to transportation. We think that if we can actually work on a North American solution, whether that's a ban or a ZEV supply mandate, that's probably the most effective way to go, and it's probably the least disruptive for the auto sector, which is an important job creator in Ontario. So that is one of the first things that I will be talking to John Kerry about, who has been appointed by President Biden to lead his climate work.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's great news. The next person who I'm going to ask to come on the line is a really passionate environmentalist in my area, Minister Peter Shepherd. He literally from the first day I was elected said, I want to see a clear, transparent plan for how you are going to reach your climate change targets. So actually it wasn't from the first day I was elected, it was after we signed on to the Paris Accord targets. I think he was looking very clearly for a clear, transparent plan that we could actually put in front of Canadians. So first I want to thank him. He's never stopped calling me, has never stopped writing to me, and has never stopped meeting with me. And I say that with a lot of heart, like it's very genuine, because we can't just talk, we have to actually do, and that's what he was asking us to do. I don't think that his question is going to be on that. I think he does have another technical question. And Peter, as you come on, if I could just ask you to keep it short, just because we have a few more questions, but I know whatever you'll ask is super important. So over to you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks very much for taking my question. I guess I've been researching pricing of carbon, and I was just noticing that there's several scientists who've said that for every ton of carbon dioxide we put out over the next 10,000 years, this will melt 625 tons of ice. And so I was curious about this about a year ago. I followed up 4 different ice making companies and found the most efficient machine in Ontario. It would cost at a wholesale rate $3,700 to $4,000 to refreeze a block of ice 625 tons. That's the size of our semi-detached house, including the volume of our basement in Toronto. And then I sort of realized that, but then another engineer in Passive Building Canada pointed out that even if you spent that money per ton carbon dioxide trying to remediate, and it was technically possible to make that ice again, that you still wouldn't have taken the heat out of the atmosphere. So therefore, carbon dioxide is effectively like kryptonite. It is something that is much more dangerous than people conceive of. And I'm just sort of wondering if you would consider using the damage to Canada's cryosphere in calculating a price on carbon, and to teach other people that even though we need to price carbon, it is technically an unpriceable good, that we will never replace that ice, the many thousands of kilometers of Canada's cryosphere.
Okay, thank you so much, Peter. Over to you, Minister. I know that's a very technical question. I don't know if you have the answer.
No, but I think the underlying point is a good one, which is, we try to quantify the social cost of carbon, and we use that to sort of guide whether or not policies are appropriate or inappropriate. But there's almost a strangeness to that, because there is an element of the cost of carbon and methane, greenhouse gases, that is irreplaceable. The ice example is a reasonable one, but biodiversity is another, right? I mean, the changes that we're seeing with respect to biodiversity that are driven in part by climate change, are irreplaceable. When you extinguish a species because it actually can't thrive in its natural environment, that's an irreplaceable cost, and it's an unquantifiable cost. So I think, I take your point. I do think that those are issues you got to think about how you communicate that, and certainly I think there is an effort to try to communicate that. But I think there's also, an ongoing effort to communicate the opportunities that are enabled through working to address climate change. Like, to be honest with you, I actually think most Canadians know that climate change is bad for the environment. And there's a reasonable chunk of folks who are very concerned and are willing to actually change behavior and want the government to act in a strong way. And then there are others who are perhaps less committed. And to motivate those folks, you also have to argue the opportunity side of the equation, which is, this actually isn't going to be bad from an economic perspective. This will be good. There are real opportunities here to take advantage of. So I think that we need to try to actually balance the messaging. And I think the really good news in Canada is it used to be the case that everybody who was concerned about climate change was concerned largely on the environmental side, and it was a smaller group. I think now the group is bigger, and part of it's bigger because the vast majority of Canadians now think that addressing climate change can be good for the economy.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Minister. And actually, that's where I'm going to go to next, is just the economy. And then I'm hoping that we'll have a question on plastics after. So a key part is, so we've announced our climate plan. So how do you envision climate featuring in Canada's economic recovery? So we're restarting the economy. And I think I mentioned to you, one of the biggest sort of letters that have come in, they mentioned sort of a green sort of recovery. I'll just mention two other elements that I'm hoping you can touch on. Olivia Hua from I think Liv Hua is how she says her first name. She asked, what entry-level jobs and job creation programs do you foresee in the government climate initiatives? And then I'd also say to you, you were talking about a just transition. You were talking about how, as a Canadian, we have to bring all our provinces along. So maybe we could talk a little bit about clean technology or renewable energy and our investment in there, and what our plan is moving forward.
Okay, those are big questions. I would say that the way we've tried to think about the economic side of this equation is there is an opportunity to look to create employment in the short term that will help people move through some of the challenges that they have had during the pandemic, to find new employment, but all at the same time to help us to build a society that's going to be more resilient and more climate friendly on a go forward basis. And the specific kinds of examples would be, the grants for home retrofits will create thousands of jobs. The money that the Canada Infrastructure Bank is putting into the development of school buses is going to create hundreds of jobs in places like New Flyer in Winnipeg, which makes electric buses. The community buildings retrofits that we are doing, the intertie work that will create, long-term construction jobs. So a lot of those are in the short term. And of course, there will be a need for us to think about skills training and transition, because, some of the folks that have been impacted by COVID-19 are not people that would normally be in those businesses. And to be honest, a lot of them will need trades, and trades have tended to be an aging workforce. So we're going to have to think about how we actually, do the kind of transition to enable the economy to actually have the workers that will help to drive those kinds of things. In the longer term, it's about making smart investments that actually will drive emissions down, but will also enable our companies to be competitive in the future. And that's like, at the end of the day, we need to actually be moving in the direction of low carbon, because low carbon is actually going to be the basis of much of international competition, where products are going to be evaluated on the basis of the carbon intensity of their production. And technologies that enable the reduction in carbon intensity are going to be increasingly important around the world. And so we need to be working to ensure our industry is prepared to compete. That's why, the Ford investment is really important. Like, if we just keep making internal combustion engines, at some point, they're all going to be out of work. The same thing is going to be true for steel and for cement and for a whole range of industries, where we actually have to work with those companies to put them on a trajectory that will actually get them to the point where they're making zero carbon steel and zero carbon cement. And there are pathways to get there, but I think the government needs to work to ensure that that's the case, and that will create employment and it will sustain employment on a go forward basis. In terms of your other question around clean tech, I mean, clean tech is a very broad term, right? Everybody, a lot of times people think about clean tech as being just energy, but it's not. I mean, clean tech is about, I think Tom Rand, who's associated with a number of things in Ontario, including a little bit with Mars, I think he put it best where he talked about clean tech and is really about lightening the environmental footprint that humans leave on this planet. And so it's about water, it's about energy efficiency, it's about energy generation, it's about air cleanup technologies, it's about a whole bunch of things. It's about recycling. And I think that that Canada is actually in a relatively fortunate situation. You know, when they did a ranking of the top 100 clean tech companies in the world last year, Canada had 12 on it. We've done a reasonably good job at actually helping to facilitate the development of ideas into products. Where Canada hasn't done a great job is how do you take those products and really commercialize them and grow, you know, big companies in Canada that actually will stay in Canada. And that's a piece of work that we continue to work on. But clean tech is going to be really important because it's going to help us to decarbonize our domestic industry, and it's going to be a really huge export opportunity in the future.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Minister. I have two more questions. One is going to be on plastics and one's on biodiversity, if that's okay.
Yeah.
It'll take you a few minutes past 7 o'clock. Are you okay to sort of stay to answer those two VIP questions?
Sure.
Okay. Particularly since you have the perfect lighting, according to David Hardy. I will totally remember that. And he's totally right. I wouldn't have noticed it until he actually mentioned it. So the next question is basically how to, you know, a question on plastic. So I think we've got Caitlin Barker who's going to ask the question. So over to you, Caitlin.
Hi, Julie. Thank you for hosting these town halls. They're great. And thank you, Jonathan, for being here. It's been wonderful to hear your input. My question's short. It's basically, I think a lot of Canadians were really looking forward to the plastics ban, but many were disappointed to see that it only includes 6 items. So my question is, will the plastic ban be expanded?
Sure. Let me just take a step back around how we sort of thought about the plastics issues. So as you probably know, what we did was looked at the science because public policy should be grounded largely on science and evidence. And so there was a study on the impacts of plastics in the environment. And what happened was the scientists came back and they said, plastics have significant negative impacts, particularly on marine life in the environment. And specific plastics have more of an impact than others. And the emerging science around microplastics would suggest that there are causes for concern, although there's not yet definitive proof that they are going to be impacting marine life, but ultimately human health. I tend to think that science is going to evolve fairly quickly. I don't know if you saw the report yesterday that said that they're now finding microplastics in the placenta of human beings, which is obviously very disturbing.
Yes.
So we looked at how do you actually try to ensure that plastics are kept out of the environment and in the economy. And so we came up with a strategy that actually has a number of different components. One component of it was the ban, and the way in which objects got on the ban were they are problematic in the environment. They cause harm in the environment. The second is that they are difficult or very costly to recycle, and the third is that they are things that there are available alternatives. So you can get rid of plastic bags because you have paper bags or reusable bags that people can use. That's how you get on the list. For all of the other plastics, and there are many, the focus then is on ensuring that you're keeping those within the economy. And the strategy for doing that is starting with what's called extended producer responsibility, where we're actually putting plastics back on the responsibility for plastics back on the manufacturers of plastics, saying, you are responsible for recycling, you are responsible for the costs, and you're responsible for hitting targets associated with how much of the products you're actually recycling. We're going to work with you on product design so that you actually will reduce the amount of plastics you're using. You're going to actually make products that are easier to recycle. And we're going to establish targets for recycled content so that you're actually using recycled content in the context of making new products. That is a strategy that Europe has adopted, and we are largely following in Europe's footsteps on that. We need provincial cooperation. That's something on which the federal government and the provinces actually largely agree on sort of where we're going on this. It's certainly possible that we could expand the ban list in the future if we find that some of the items that presently would be in the recycling category are difficult or costly to recycle beyond what we understand today. But the focus definitely is keeping plastics generally out of the environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that when I was on Environment Committee, I think just even having a national plastic standard, I think was a huge thing. Just because how do you make sure that, you know, Tim Hortons and all your coffee shops produce the exact same, you know,
no, it's true.
standard?
And industry
and
has said to us, you can't have different standards in 10 different provinces. Like, it's just not, you can't do that. And so this is one area where I say the provinces have been willing to cooperate, because I think they understand that it would not be an efficient use of resources for us to have different standards across the country.
And I know that also, Minister, I know that it's funny because I often talk about a circular economy, and I think we have a bit of a game. We do have a game plan for plastics, although I think that people would love if we expanded beyond. But anyways, I know we're trying to achieve a lot of things. Okay, I'm going to get the next two questions in together. They're on two completely different topics, but because you're so skilled, I know you'll be able to respond to them. So we're going to first have Livio, who's going to ask on biodiversity, and then we're going to have Chris Kiefer, who's going to squeeze on something on the nuclear sector. Over to you, Livio.
Hi, good evening, Minister Wilkinson. Great to have you join us for this town hall, and also to answer the questions. I think if I had one wish, it would be that every Canadian could listen to these answers and understand them, and I think it would take away a lot of the misinformation that gets put out there by, including our Premier here in Ontario. So that would be my wish. But I think I'm going to bring a question into the fray about biodiversity. Obviously, climate change is around saving our natural environment and making sure that not only people can enjoy it, but the plants and animals that are inside of our nature can also keep on using it the way it was meant to be. And I guess, how does the climate change plan address slowing down and then ultimately, hopefully, stopping the loss of biodiversity in Canada?
Perfect. Thanks so much, Livio. And then Chris Kiefer, if we can sort of have you with a quick question.
Okay, just unmuted myself. Hi, Minister Wilkinson. Thanks so much for virtually coming to Davenport. My name is Chris Kiefer. I'm a local emergency physician. I care deeply about upstream social and environmental determinants of health. And strangely, I'm also the director of Canadians for Nuclear Energy, which is a new grassroots coalition made of environmentalists, health, and labor advocates. We actually have a House of Commons petition that's been sponsored by Julie with over 2,600 signatures. It points out that nuclear energy powered North America's single greatest greenhouse gas reductions measure, which was getting rid of coal in Ontario. So 90% of the energy for that came from nuclear. You know, as a physician working during that period, I saw respiratory health improve dramatically. Smog days went from 53 in 2005 to 0 in 2014. We now have an open letter that we're just about to publish, signed by James Hansen and Carrie Emanuel, two of the world's most famous climate scientists, who are calling for Canada to embrace nuclear energy as a keystone technology. You've talked a lot about a green recovery. 95% of our nuclear supply chain is in Canada. Every dollar spent on nuclear stays in the economy. So my question is, you know, with the terrible human and economic damage that COVID has caused, will your government stand with James Hansen and others to commit to supporting nuclear energy as a keystone part of the green recovery?
That's great. Thank you so much. And Minister, I should mention, Chris had mentioned that he's an emergency room physician. He's been really wonderful, by the way, during these COVID times whenever I have questions. But I also want to mention Livio's a small business owner within the community, and he also works within the environmental sector. So really appreciate being on. And I wouldn't mind maybe as a third thing that if you have time to address this, you know, Livio brings up a very good point about communication, and that did come out in a lot of our questions. A lot of people said, you know, the opposition seems to be very good in terms of finding a way to promote, you know, their storyline. How are we going to make sure that we get our story, our narrative, our messages out to the Canadian population? So I'll leave you with those three, and then I'll say my thank yous and wish you well.
Okay, so three different and all very important questions. On the biodiversity side, there is an increasing movement internationally to try to tie climate and biodiversity together in these conversations. In fact, the United Kingdom has been leading a lot of this, and their intention for COP26, when it eventually happens in Glasgow, is that we'll actually focus not just on climate change, but also on biodiversity loss. They are obviously inextricably linked, but they're not the same thing. You know, climate is driving biodiversity loss, but so is the loss of habitat and the destruction of habitat for many species, not only here in Canada, but certainly in other parts of the world. Probably the best example is in the Amazon. And so a part of the climate plan is about trying to address one piece of the threat to biodiversity, which is the changing habitat that happens as the climate warms. You know, you see that here in British Columbia with Pacific salmon, which is an iconic species. I mean, the rivers now get so warm in the summer that the salmon, as they migrate up, have a very difficult time having the energy to actually get back to where they spawn because simply the temperature of the water. So there's that piece, and then there's the second piece, which is about habitat, and so we will be coming forward with you know, our plan as to how we're going to deliver on the commitment that we made in the campaign around protecting 25% of Canada's marine areas and land by 2025 and 30% by 2030. And that is really about creating spaces where we don't have industrial activity, where you actually are creating those spaces ideally in areas that are very important from a biodiversity perspective to ensure that you're doing what you can to maintain habitat to keep populations up. And then the third leg of it is around enforcing the Species at Risk Act. You know, we have an act federally that requires us to try to push the provinces and at times coerce the provinces with respect to addressing species when they do become endangered. The expectation at the time when we put in the Species at Risk Act, this was well before my time, but was that the provinces would put mirror legislation in place so that they would be the first line of defense. They have most of the territory and they're responsible for most of the territory. Of course, almost none of them have. Ontario had a form of species at risk legislation. I would say it probably still needed improvement, but the Ford government has effectively dismantled big chunks of it. And so we need to continue at the federal level to work to, at times push, sometimes collaborate with provinces and territories to ensure that they're doing the right things with respect to respecting and trying to recover species that are at risk. But I would say to you folks, and I know you live probably in one of the more progressive ridings in the province, that it's really important for the public to put pressure on their provinces to be responsible with respect to some of these issues. These are, you know, when you lose a species, it's gone forever. And this is not, you know, this is not a game. I mean, at the end of the day, people need to take this seriously. On the second issue with respect to nuclear, I mean, the phase out of coal in Ontario was, you know, an enormous achievement. I think many people don't recognize how big a step that was. And that was a big step for climate, but it was an enormously big step, as you pointed out, for public health in terms of actually just cleaning up the air quality that existed in many parts of the province. Nuclear energy played a role there, and nuclear energy plays a big role in some states. I mean, if you go to France, I think it's 70 or 80% of their electricity grid is nuclear power. The interest in nuclear power these days seems to have shifted a little bit from large-scale nuclear facilities to what are called small modular reactors, which are more distributed, so smaller scale, distributed nuclear facilities. And this is a technology that is being developed by a number of different companies in different parts of the country. I think it's really New Brunswick, Ontario, and Saskatchewan that are particularly interested in pushing this. We are interested in that technology as you know, potentially a source of baseload energy. Of course, you know, the problem with solar and wind is the intermittency. You get lots of power when the sun shines and the turbines turn in the wind, and much less when they don't. And so they have an issue around storage of energy, and there is lots of work going on storage. But certainly nuclear offers the potential for baseload in the same way that that hydro does. And so we're very interested in that. We've said to those provinces that we're interested in fostering the development and the demonstration of that technology. And assuming that you can get through the demonstration to commercialization, it's an interesting technology that I think we need to be looking at all non-emitting technologies, and nuclear is one of those. But I would say that in the long run, nuclear will have to be able to compete on a cost basis with other alternatives. And some of those alternatives will be things like wind and solar if you can make big strides in storage. And so at the end of the day, I think it's absolutely worth us pushing that. I think we should be looking at all available options because, you know, getting to net zero is not simple. And it may well be that that's part of the solution. But I do believe that there are significant advancements that are being made in other non-emissions generating technologies that with which it will need to compete, and that's all to the good. Because at the end of the day, what you want is electricity that's generated at a price that's going to be the most affordable for people, if it's equal in terms of non-emitting. And then the last thing, and one final thing on the nuclear thing, I think it's admirable the work that you folks are doing, and I think that's great. As you know, nuclear energy is quite controversial in the environmental community, where there are many environmental organizations that are adamantly opposed to nuclear power. I think that was driven from history and historical you know, issues that nuclear power had in the past. It's also driven by the issue of waste, you know, because there is no long-term answer other than storage for waste. And so that does concern people. But I do think that it is important in the context of a climate crisis for all of us to be looking at all of the available non-emitting technologies that can help us with the crisis. And then the last question is, how do we promote this? How do we get our messages out? And I guess I would turn that a little bit back, which is, I recognize that I worked, when I first got elected, Julie knows, I was actually parliamentary secretary to Catherine McKenna for the first couple of years and worked very closely with her in the development of the Pan-Canadian Framework. And then the Prime Minister asked me to go be Minister of Fisheries, and I got to work on biodiversity in the marine areas. And then the Prime Minister asked me to do this. So I lived through the Pan-Canadian Framework and all of the challenges, and I would tell you, particularly within our own caucus, people saying, well, you're not communicating it very well, you're not communicating it very well. And I do think that there's kind of two elements to that. One is, I think we perhaps overcomplicate the message sometimes, and we need to find a way to make it something that people will hear, understand, and remember. I think the one issue that this government actually communicated quite well during its first 4 years in office was the issue around the Canada Child Benefit. And that was because you could encapsulate it in a way where people would remember it. We would all say, you know, the Canada Child Benefit in one fell swoop lifted 300,000 Canadian children out of poverty. And everybody would be like, ooh, that's a really good thing. And it is. It was a phenomenal thing. And it fundamentally changed the dynamics around poverty in this country. But I think we need to figure out a way to communicate this, you know, in a manner that we will talk about it and people will remember it. And we are trying to think about how most effectively to do that. But I am very, very open to suggestions. And so to the extent that you folks have suggestions, please give them to Julie, and I would be very open to hearing about them. So.
Thank you so much. So, Minister, you have been really wonderful with your time, so I really appreciate it. I'm going to start off actually by thanking everyone in Davenport for their advocacy, their leadership, their passion on this issue. Don't stop. We're only going to move forward as quickly as we need to move forward and as aggressively if I continue to have your support behind us and continue to be holding us to account and pushing us to do better. And so I just want to say huge thanks to the community. I want to say a huge thanks to my team for helping me organize this and organize everyone. So thanks to Paul, to Monica, to Nasser, to Alex for all that you do. So thanks for doing that. I also want to thank your team, Minister. I know your team's been working night and day on putting together the climate plan, and I've met with a number of them over the last few weeks, and they truly are remarkable. And so I just want to honor their work by publicly acknowledging them and thanking them. I hope they get a break over Christmas, because the work continues next year. We can never stop on this, and we can never stop moving aggressively and as urgently as possible. And the last thanks is to you, whether you have great lighting or not. You are a wonderful Minister of Environment and Climate Change. Thanks for your leadership. Thanks for making the time, you know, the week before Christmas to meet with the Davenport community. And we look forward to working with you moving forward. So wish you the best, and thanks for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone. Have a good night.